Greetings and welcome to the PLSQL channel, a series of video trainings on the Oracle PLSQL language. My name is Stephen Feuerstein, and I'm a PL/SQL developer, just like you. This lesson is part of my series on error management in Oracle PLSQL, and the focus is on basic concepts. Some quick reminders. You can access all of the code that I'll be using to demonstrate my various techniques and features, and also supporting PowerPoint documents from PLSQL Obsession, which is available at toadworld.com/sf. Let's take a quick look. Here's PLSQL Obsession. Simply click here to download the demo zip file that contains about 2,000 scripts that I use in all of my different trainings. Training seminars and presentations give you access to various PowerPoints. Back to it. Make sure you're comfortable with the material covered in the previous lessons in this series, which in this case is not very much. It's just the introduction. We're just getting started. So let's get started. The agenda for basic concepts. First, I'll talk about what an exception is in PLSQL. We'll take a look at exceptions and block execution, so how exceptions affect the way that PLSQL blocks work. The exception session itself. The idea of propagation of exceptions out of blocks. And let's dive in. So first of all, what is an exception? An exception is an error condition, so one that can arise either from internal Oracle processing. Oracle detects an error and raises it as an exception in PLSQL. It could be a bug in my code. It could be a problem with application data. Something has gone wrong, and an exception is raised in my block of code in my current session. Now, exceptions can be defined by Oracle, and many of them are, or we can actually define our own. So no data found is an example of an Oracle or system-defined exception, which is quite common. If I do a select into and it doesn't find any rows, Oracle raises the no data found exception. And Oracle provides the error messages manual to show you all the defined Oracle errors. Let's take a look at how you can see that information. There are two websites that I know about from Oracle that provide searchable access to all the Oracle documentation, tahiti.oracle.com and docs.oracle.com, and they each have their different ways to go about accessing the documentation. I like Tahiti because it's a mod PLSQL application. It's built entirely in PLSQL. And here we are at tahiti.oracle.com. Anyway, you can search for things, but if you just click on a database version, and then on the upper left you can see error messages. This will take you into the error messages manual, and you can see all the different categories of errors. So ORA- are the Oracle errors. PLS- are the PLSQL errors, compile errors. And PLW are the PLSQL warnings. So all these different ORA- give you access to all that Oracle error information. Obviously, this is not the sort of book you're going to go reading on the weekends, but it's important to know it's there and that you can get to it. Okay, let's talk about exceptions and block execution. So all PLSQL code that you'll ever write executes inside a block. And when an exception is raised inside a block, normal processing stops, and in particular, the executable section, assuming it started, is immediately terminated. So whatever code was being run stops. The exception is raised in my session. Control is then passed to the exception section of the block if it's present. And then the exception is either handled, which means that there's some code inside that block of code that says I'll grab this error, I'll log it, I'll do something with it, and or it's propagated out. So the exception comes out of the current block unhandled. And we'll talk in detail about propagation a bit later, but let's take a look at a simple example. Here's my exception propagation example. I have an outer block, starts with declare, declares a variable max length 10. Inside this block, so there's my executable section starting, I have another nested block of code. It has its own executable section in which I assign a value of Stephen Feuerstein to my string. I have an exception section for this block of code that traps the no data found exception with a when clause, and then it displays the message, where's the data? Then I have a for loop after my block of code, and then after that at the very end for my outer block, I have the exception section for that block. When others says trap anything that might have occurred, and then I log the error. So let's run this block of code and then trace through, see what happens. I look at my output and I find it says error trapped -6502. The -6502 is the value error exception, which is the error that's raised when I assign a value that's too small of the container. So let's see what happened here. Notice it doesn't say where's the data. So I've declared my string. This executable section starts. Then the next executable nested section starts. I try to assign a value to my variable. It raises the value error exception. So this block terminates. Control is passed to the exception section since it's present. I look for a match, or Oracle looks for a match on the Oracle error number, and value error is not the same as no data found, so this code never runs. The exception comes out of this block unhandled, which means this block terminates, comes down to the exception section, finds a match for one others because it'll always fall into one others if nothing else, and then calls log the error and displays this message. So that's what was going on in this block of code, and it shows how exceptions can be raised by Oracle. They are trapped, handled or not handled, and then propagated out to the enclosing blocks if the exception is not handled or if it's re-raised. Moving on, let's take a look at another example when strings don't fit. And let's go right over to the code example and run it in Toad. Now in this block of code, I'm going to declare a variable, maximum length 5. Again, a nested block inside my main block assigns a value that's too big, exception section, value error, and so on. Let's run the code, and then again I'll walk through it, and we'll make sure that you have a very clear understanding of the process here. So what was displayed when I run this block of code was inner block 0 in what error? And I suggest that you try this on your own and walk through the code yourself to understand why you got this output before I'm about to do it. So I suggest you pause your video, take a look at this code, and see if you can understand why these three strings are displayed. Okay, let's do it. So I assign a variable max length 5. In my inner block, I assign a big string to it, more than 5 characters. This assignment, or the attempt to do the assignment, raises a value error exception, which means this code never runs. This block is terminated. It comes down to the exception section. It finds a match. The value error exception was the exception that was raised, and it finds a match on the Oracle error code -6502. So it then executes this code, and it displays inner block. Now notice I don't have another exception in this handler. I don't raise an exception, or nothing causes an exception. So this block terminates without an exception being propagated out. As a result, the outer block doesn't know anything about the fact that an error occurred in the inner block. It keeps on going. And then it displays the error code. SQL code always returns 0 if it's not inside an exception section, and no error. And then it displays what error. So this exception section never comes into play because the exception is trapped in the inner block and it is not re-raised. If, on the other hand, I added the raise semicolon statement here, which I'll talk about in the next lesson on raising errors, this will cause the same statement, the same exception, to be re-raised. And now when I run this block of code, I see different output. Inner block, and then outer block. So it displayed inner block, and then it said, well, I'm not done here. I need to force the outer block to stop as well. This is a serious error. So re-raise the exception. This block terminates with an unhandled exception. Comes out to the outer block, terminates that block, finds a match on the exception, value error, and displays outer block. Let's talk a bit more about the exception section. First of all, it's optional. You don't have to have an exception section in any of your blocks, though it's often a good idea to have one so that you can trap errors and store or log information that's local to that block that might have caused the error. But in any case, you can leave it in or out, and it contains one or more when clauses. And the body of each clause contains executable statements. In fact, you can have an entire nested block inside a when clause. And that's the code that's executed when a match is found between the exception that was raised and the error specified in the when clause. You can specify more than one exception in a when clause using the or clause. You can say when value error or no data found. And the when others clause is the catch-all clause. If no other handler catches the exception, then others will, and it has to be the last handler in the section. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's an exception section with the when clause for a single exception, value error, the -6502 error. Here's an example of checking for two different exceptions. If either one of these occur, if it's no data found or too many rows, then I want to take the same action. You can't have an and when no data found and too many rows because, of course, only one exception can be raised at a time. And finally, we have the when others, the catch-all handler that will run when anything else fails or when no exception is trapped previously. So these are the three basic forms that you'll be following. Notice you do not see an error number. You don't say when -6503. You have to trap, or the when clause has to specify errors by name or others. Inside an exception handler, I could call SQL code to find out what the actual error code is, but you can't use that error number in the when clause itself. So back to exception propagation. When an exception is raised, the current block does not contain a handler for it, the exception propagates out. So if this block does not trap the error, or if for any reason an error is raised again from within the when clause, it passes it out, which causes the termination of the outer block, etc. And if it comes all the way out of PLSQL, it's an unhandled exception, and the host environment usually will commit or perform a rollback. So PLSQL can return completely unhandled exceptions to its host environment. Remember, PLSQL is an embedded language, so it's always being called by something else. And that host environment, whether it be SQL+, or Toad, or your application, your website, that environment can decide what to do about it. Usually, when you get an unhandled exception back to the host environment, Oracle or the host environment will perform a rollback, but that's not necessarily the case. And something that you should keep in mind, and we'll look at with an example right now, is that if an exception is raised in the declaration section, it's always propagated to the enclosing block. In other words, the exception section of a block only can handle exceptions raised in the executable section of code. Let's take a look at my exception quiz 2 script. So I'm going to run this code and we'll see what happens. I suggest that you pause the video and study this code and determine for yourself what you believe is going to happen before I run it. So in this block of code, I declare a variable called aname. And then inside my main body of code, my main block, I have a nested block with another declaration section, another variable called aname. Now I recommend that you never do this. Don't call variables with the same name in nested blocks. It's not that Oracle will get confused, but will get confused. So any reference to aname inside this inner block is resolved to be this one, not this one. In any case, let's run this code. Let's see what happens and explain it. And in this case, all I get is outer block. Let's see why that happened. So in my declaration section of my inner block, I declare my variable. I assign it a value big string. It's too big. This assignment raises the value error exception. But notice I've got an exception handler for my block of code. It traps value error and it displays inner block. But we didn't see the word inner block. Why not? Well, because the way Oracle arranges things is that if an exception is raised in the declaration section of your block, Oracle says, well, the block hasn't even started. So this exception section cannot come into play. Exceptions raised in the declaration section always force a complete termination of that block of code with an unhandled exception. Comes out to the outer block. And since it's unhandled, the exception has been raised, this block terminates, so none of this code runs. Since there's an exception section, it looks for a match on the exception name or number, value error, there is a match, and it displays outer block. So that's the key thing to remember. An exception raised in the declaration section can never be trapped in the exception section for that block. And the basic rationale is we might have declared variables here. For example, another variable, lNumber. And this variable was never even initialized for use in the block of code because the error was raised here. So if I try to look at the number down here in my exception section, well, that variable's not yet been initialized. It's an uncertain state. So Oracle says, forget it. The exception raised here forces the exception out to the enclosing block. To draw some conclusions. Errors in the database or in our code cause exceptions to be raised in PLSQL, which terminates normal processing, which means that the currently executing executable section stops. You can catch or trap exceptions with the exception section. It's optional, but it's a good idea to have on most of your PLSQL blocks, including stored procedures, stored functions, and initialization sections of packages. And exceptions will propagate out to the enclosing block if they are not caught and if no exception is then re-raised. And note again, exceptions raised in the declaration section are always propagated out. Next steps. If you haven't yet done so, download the demo zip script, unzip it, try out the exception quizzes that I showed you in this lesson. Make sure that you can read a piece of code and you can predict accurately what will happen when certain errors are raised, how the different exception sections and the when clauses will process those errors. And then watch the next videos in the error management series, how to define, raise, and handle exceptions. I hope this lesson has been useful to you, and I wish you happy PLSQL coding into the future.